on throughout the event. Thank you so much. So it gives me great pleasure to be hosting this webinar, and I thank you all for joining us. Please feel free to use the chat throughout the event, and we will have some time for questions at the end. Please, if you could post them in the chat, we will endeavour to get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. So tonight we will be talking about Australia's biggest climate decision, the Burrup Hub. Not only is this a project that has many moving parts, it has enormous and wide-ranging implications. I must pass on, first of all, an apology. We were due to hear from Josie Alec, Kumara and Martha Donera woman, and First Nations lead at the Australian Conservation Foundation. But unfortunately, Josie has had some pretty drastic technical failures just this morning, meaning she could not join us. She sends her sincere apologies. However, she has given her blessing for Piers Verstegen, who has graciously joined us to take her place. Piers is a veteran of many climate campaigns and will talk about the impacts of the acid gas from Burrup Hub infrastructure. And also, Piers has kindly offered to touch on WA gas markets and economics. Martin Pritchard, the Director of Strategy at Environs Kimberley, will then tell us how the Burrup Hub could see the Kimberley turned into an industrial fracking wasteland, which would put groundwater, communities and agriculture at risk. Then Ruby Hamilton from the Environmental Defenders Office will join us to give an overview of where key Burrup Hub assessment decisions are at. And we'll also run through some of the climate implications from this massive project. But first, we'll cross to Anna Chapman, Fossil Fuels Program Manager at the Conservation Council of WA, to give us an overview of exactly what the Burrup Hub is and how it threatens a pristine reef off of WA's northwest coast. Anna, thanks so much for joining us. How are you going tonight?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Liam. As Liam said, I'm going to give an overview of the Burrup Hub threat. And so on my next slide, what I quickly want to do is just a quick recap, although I'm sure everybody knows the science, but, you know, we're all doing this because the science says it really is a must to protect us from the impacts of climate change and stop those impacts. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has released a number of reports, but the key takeaway is that greenhouse gas emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure is more than enough to push the world beyond 1.5 degrees of global heating compared to pre-industrial times. So what does this mean? There should be no new gas projects. All fossil fuels must decline imminently for 1.5 degree pathway, and we need to ramp up renewables and phase out fossil fuels. And really, we need to act now. And on my next slide, you'll see that WA is really a big contributor. So particularly in Australia, WA is the only state in Australia with emissions above 2005 levels. So the national target is a 43% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. And our emissions are above 2005 levels, and our emissions are increasing. So that's majorly concerning, and all the hard work from other states across the country is getting undone by Western Australia. We have no 2030 target. So big gas is fueling the climate crisis more than any other industry in WA. So that's where the major problem lies. On my next slide, you can see just a representation of the scale of gas exports from Western Australia. So LNG is liquefied natural gas, really just the way gas is processed for export. And so this shows that if WA was a country, it would be the third largest exporter of LNG. So that's quite phenomenal. And with that, in turn has emissions. And so that's what WA is responsible for. So what is the Burrup Hub? Well, this is Woodside's Burrup Hub mega gas project. This is one of their maps, and it's on the northwest coast of Western Australia, and it's the most polluting fossil fuel project proposed in the Southern Hemisphere. So it really is huge in terms of a project, but also in terms of emissions. And what Woodside has done is separate this mega project into components, and is seeking approval for a few of these, which I'll come to in just a moment. But on my next slide is a representation for the emissions of the Burrup Hub. So if all plans get approved, the Burrup Hub will belch out 6.1 billion tonnes of emissions over its lifetime. And that's around 13 times Australia's annual emissions. So this is Australia's biggest climate threat. It is also threatens the health of communities and the survival of our precious marine life and ecosystems. And I'm going to talk a little bit to that in a moment. But the Burrup Hub has key components that are up for approval that must be stopped for the sake of our climate and nature. And so what you see here is the Northwest Shelf project, also called Karratha Gas Plant. So Woodside's currently seeking an extension of this gas plant, and it's one of the oldest and most polluting gas plants in Australia. If this extension receives government approval, it paves the way for WA to process gas and export until 2070. So this is completely at odds with our national target of net zero emissions by 2050. And the same with the WA state government has the same target. So where is this decision now? It's being assessed by the WA EPA, and it's currently undergoing a state appeals process, but the decision by the Minister Whitby is imminent, and the Federal Environment Minister will eventually look at whether it gets approved or not as well. So on my next slide, and this connects to the Northwest Shelf. So if Woodside wants to extend gas processing to 2070, it's going to need more gas. And part of this is the Browse gas field that lies under this beautiful, pristine Scott Reef. And so Woodside wants to drill gas at this reef and pump the gas through 900 kilometers of pipeline, which goes through 2 marine parks to the Northwest Shelf plant. And Woodside is planning to surround, so it's going to be 50 gas wells in and around, around the reef, and the closest one is going to be 2 kilometers from the reef edge, which has quite a lot of nature impacts, because Scott Reef, on my next slide, you'll see just a few images from Greenpeace, and absolutely stunning. So it's one of the most ecologically significant marine environments in the world, and we're currently working with an expert to really delve into the detail of how unique this reef is. And this sanctuary is, this reef is a sanctuary for many species, and that includes endangered green sea turtles and pygmy blue whales that are now at risk. So the WA Environmental Protection Authority has already found that Browse project poses unacceptable risks to the whales, turtles, and the risk of oil spill at the reef. So we must ensure that there's no new fossil fuel projects, and this is for the future of the reef and for a livable climate. So the nature, whereas at the reef, the climate impacts to nature, and also just, incredible emissions if this project's get approval and go ahead. So where is the Browse decision at? So Browse being the gas field under this reef, it's being assessed by the WA EPA and the Commonwealth, and the two assessments are separate and run in parallel. So just to show an example of the Montara oil spill in the Timor Sea, this is one of the risks that the EPA is extremely concerned about. And on the next slide, you'll see some, the modeling was commissioned by Woodside, and Greenpeace has created this great depiction of what it could look like. But the potential for well blowout could release over 142,000 cubic meters of unstabilized condensate in the ocean over 77 days. And so this is really scary. And I would see that there could be risks on the coast. And I would be interested to see if, there was independent research, what that could show. So that's my quick overview of the Burrup Hub and the massive threat that it's causing. So thank you, Liam.
Thanks so much, Anna, for that overview of the Burrup Hub, Australia's biggest climate decision. I always find it truly staggering that 13 times Australia's national emissions figure from just one project. It's pretty hard to fathom. But yes, some stunning imagery there of Scott Reef. Thanks so much for sharing that. All right, I am going to pass over to Piers Verstegen. If anyone was late to this call, Piers has kindly agreed to fill in for Josie, who was a very late apology today. So thank you very much, Piers. I'm going to pass over to you to talk about the impacts of the acid gas that is streaming from the Burrup Hub on Murujuga Rock Art, and also to touch on some WA gas market and economic figures. You got your screen share there ready to go. All yours, mate. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Liam, and g'day everyone. And great to see so much interest in the Burrup Hub issues. I'm sorry I'm not Josie Alec, but I'm going to give I guess, a white fella kind of version of the issues to do with impacts on cultural heritage on Murujuga. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the 5 different language groups that still have some sort of cultural association with that area: the Matathunia, the Yabarara, the Ngalama, Yinjimbandi, and the Wangatu. The fact is that the Burrup Peninsula, where Woodside's LNG facilities are located, is one of the most amazing cultural heritage sites in the world. It's currently proposed for World Heritage listing. And that is because there's over 1 million petroglyphs or rock carvings across that landscape. It documents the continuous human occupation for over 50,000 years. There's no other place like that on Earth. The rock art extends below the present sea level because some of it was created at times when there was lower sea levels. It includes the earliest known depiction of the human face and many extinct megafauna, and it's the most concentrated area of Aboriginal heritage sites in Australia. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history to why there's giant LNG facilities there and what their ongoing impact is and what we might be able to do about that. If my screen works. Okay, so that's what the cultural landscape of Murujuga looks like, and the physical landscape. It's not just the individual rock carvings that are important, but the entire physical and cultural landscape. I will need to acknowledge that Murujuga was the site of one of the worst massacres in Australia's frontier war, and that occurred in 1868, where 60 Yabarara men, women and children were killed. And so that sets a bit of a scene for why industry has been allowed to move into this landscape and cause such serious damage. That started with Woodside with the construction of the Northwest Shelf LNG facility in the 1980s. And there's a picture of Ken Mulvaney salvaging some of the rock art or documenting it in front of the bulldozers. And he estimated that around about 5,000 petroglyphs were destroyed in the construction of that facility at the time. It's a matter of perspective whether you consider that to be significant today. Raylene Cooper is there from Save Our Songlines, and she was there with her mother, watched when those bulldozers were destroying their cultural heritage, and still bears the scars of that today, whereas Meg O'Neill, the CEO of Woodside, said that they did it in a way that was culturally sensitive at the time. But the fact of the matter is that the WA government and Commonwealth government have promoted the Burrup as an industrial park for a very long time. This is from 2001. before some of the most recent facilities were built there. And part of this history is, of course, the compulsory acquisition of this area from Aboriginal people, essentially, and the compulsory acquisition and the removal of the native title rights. And in that process, the state government formed the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation with representatives of the 5 language groups, but they inserted gag clauses into those agreements which prevented the parties from raising objections to industry. And MAC still exists to this day, of course, but a lot of its funding is from industry, and so it's in a particularly difficult position in terms of representing traditional custodians. In 2007, Malcolm Turnbull there did 2 things. He inscribed the Burrup Hub on the National Heritage List, which gave it the cultural heritage some legislative protection. But he also, in the same year, approved Woodside's Pluto LNG facility, the second one that was built. And a further 800 petroglyphs or rock art were removed and destroyed to build the Pluto facility. There was Aboriginal-led protest against the construction of Pluto at the time, back in 2007, but it didn't get a lot of traction. In 2012, there was an emergency assessment of the heritage values. It was listed, as I said, as a National Heritage Place. And Carmen Lawrence, who was the chair of the Australian Heritage Council, commissioned a major report which found that continued industrial development was the primary ongoing physical threat to the site. Now, that didn't change anything, unfortunately, because the removal of rock art continues today. And this is a picture just from a few weeks ago with the construction of the Perdaman fertiliser plant. This will be Western Australia's largest gas consumer, and it will take gas from Woodside's Scarborough gas project and is being built on Murujuga. You can see some images of that there. So this is further damage to the cultural landscape and further impacts to rock art. The Premier at the time said that there won't be any more industrial development after this one fertiliser plant. Okay, well, that sounds like a good thing, but the problem is that there's ongoing impacts to the rock art from acid gas emissions that result from Woodside's industrial facilities. And that is a major concern for traditional custodians and experts that have been raising concerns about this for a long time. The acid gas emissions constitute mainly NOx, nitrogen dioxide and sulfur oxides. And you can see from that graph that the major source of them is Woodside's Northwest Shelf LNG facility, responsible for about 80% of that pollution. And the image on the left is from the Copernicus satellite, which is from the European Commission. And it just shows the concentration of nitrogen dioxide there above Woodside's facilities. They are, according to the National Pollutant Inventory, releasing about 25 tonnes per day of these acid gases above the Burrup. And as I said, about 80% of that is coming from the Northwest Shelf facility, more from the Pluto facility, and then there's more from the port and from Yarra Fertilisers. But by far and away, the major source is Northwest Shelf facility. So scientists have been raising concerns for a very long time now about the impacts of this acidity on the rock art. And there's a group of scientists that have been independently documenting this that I've been working with. Here you can see some images that they have shown about the impacts of that acid on the surface of the rock art. Now, the state government has attempted to do monitoring of this for a long time, not very well. But in 2021, the CEO of the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation said that he thinks the monitoring will provide the scientific evidence to prove beyond doubt that the emissions are affecting the cultural heritage. So that was back in 2021. So let's take a look at what the government monitoring is showing. And by the way, this has been named as Juukan Gorge in slow motion by a number of people, including traditional custodians concerned about this. But the government monitoring now shows that no sites on Murujuga are free from the impacts of this acid pollution. Most monitored sites are showing 100 to 1,000 times more acidic than background levels on the surface of those rocks. And as I mentioned, Woodside's LNG facilities are responsible for about 90% of that total acid pollution. So this is an ongoing disaster, really, that's affecting Aboriginal heritage site and an Australian and World Heritage site of global significance that we all should know about and we all should take action to protect. And it's absolutely disgraceful that this is not only allowed to happen now, but is proposed to continue for a further until 2070, for nearly 50 years, by which time there's going to be permanent damage to this rock art. So that's a little overview of the cultural heritage and its impacts. I just have a few slides now to talk about the economic impacts, which is another dimension of these projects. It's been mentioned that Woodside is running out of gas from its existing gas fields, and so is looking for other gas to feed, in particular, the Northwest Shelf extension. And it's now targeting some of the largest undeveloped gas fields on the planet. And Martin will talk to you about the Canning Basin and the Kimberley. But it also means that Woodside is now targeting Western Australia's domestic gas reserves. So this is reserves of gas that are onshore in Western Australia that have always in the past been reserved for our domestic market. And we've already seen approvals to allow Woodside to export from Western Australia's domestic gas reserves. And that means that Northwest Shelf is already the largest consumer from Western Australia's domestic gas market. And the future demand from the Northwest Shelf facility, if it's approved, will be larger than all other gas uses in Western Australia combined. So that's more than all other industry, households, and electricity production using gas will be required to continue the operation of the Northwest Shelf extension. And you can see on that graph, that's that orange chunk there of the total demand for gas from the Northwest Shelf facility. Browse Basin gas is in yellow if they do get that up. And you can see that doesn't meet anywhere near the full amount of gas that they require. So they're coming after our onshore gas and are coming after our domestic gas reserves. And this is Colin Barnett, who said not so long ago that gas that's onshore in Western Australia belongs to the West Australian government, doesn't belong to the companies. And the biggest risk to gas security in WA is the discussions going on with Labor that onshore gas can be exported. That should never be allowed to happen. What has happened is that since Labor approved the export of gas from our domestic reserves, we've seen our gas and energy prices go up dramatically here in Western Australia. And you can see that impact there. The red is the gas price here in WA, and the black is the electricity price, which is very linked to the gas price because we use so much gas to generate electricity in this state. So that's bad news for Western Australian homes and businesses that use gas and electricity. It's good news for Woodside because Woodside makes more money because it sells gas into this market. So it suits them quite well. But what it shows is that there is now a linkage between Western Australia's gas prices that we're paying at home and the international gas price that Woodside can export to. So we've been having a little bit of fun with this just recently, and you'll see some more of this material and campaign roll out in the coming weeks. But basically, the message to Western Australians is that more gas exports equals higher energy bills for Western Australians. And in particular, the Northwest Shelf extension is the problem here. There's no other LNG facility in WA that is seeking to export gas from our domestic reserves because they are all supplied from offshore fields other than the Northwest Shelf facility. So the changes to the domestic gas policy to enable onshore gas to be exported is entirely to support the profits of Woodside. and will drive up Western Australian gas prices. And we intend to make that clear to Western Australians in the coming weeks and months. And we hope that that's a message that you can share. So I think that's it from me, Liam. I hope I haven't exceeded the time, and we can have questions at the end if you like.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Piers. I just lost track of time because I was listening too intently. But thank you very much for that brilliant and quite sobering overview of what's happening up on the Burrup Hub. It's just culturally sensitive is certainly not what comes to mind when I think of Woodside's activities up there, and yet truly sad to see what's continuing to happen with new construction, but also the ongoing acid gas impacts. All right, we are moving right along to, as Piers mentioned, Martin Pritchard from Environ's Kimberley, and as both Piers and Anna have touched on, the Northwest Shelf is a gas processing plant, but they have to get that gas from somewhere. So Martin's going to tell us how that will be a massive threat to the Kimberley and everything we hold sacred and beautiful about that place. Martin, over to you, my friend. I'm going to share my screen with your slides on it now. There you go, mate.
Thank you very much. You can see there, yeah, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land I'm on at the moment, Rubibi Broom, and all the traditional owners, the 30 language groups that are in the Kimberley. So, yeah, I guess, you know, you've had a bit of a taste there of actually what's happening in the Northwest here. And I guess what I'm going to be talking about is that the Northwest Shelf is an enabler of fracking the Kimberley because it needs so much gas. So we'll move on to the next slide. Just a reminder, why is the Kimberley so special? If you look in that bottom right box there, you can see the coast of Northern Australia. It's got that blue fringe around it. And if you look at the key there, very low impact areas around the globe. Northern Australia and the Kimberley is, and if you just do a click there, in the top 4% of the most intact coastlines on the planet. And, you know, just showing the global significance of the coast. Next slide. Showing the most intact tropical savanna in the world is in Northern Australia. You can see that blue there, and on the left-hand corner, you can see the integrity of the tropical savanna, how there's very little left that is of high integrity, gone from, you know, largely gone from South America and Central Africa, India. So, you know, another reason why it's globally significant. We'll move on to the next one. Keep going on these, Liam. So, you know, we've got, because it's so intact, we've got all these threatened species like the northern quoll, Gouldian finch, spectacled hair wallaby, the rock wallaby, and the bilby that are still here, still a significant last bastion of nature. We'll move on to the next slide. Because of that, you know, because of the incredible intactness of the landscape, and obviously because of the, you know, the ancient living culture that we still have here, we do have a significant $600 million tourism industry that is dependent on intact landscapes and on people still continuing to carry on their culture. And down the bottom there, you've got examples of, for example, Bart Pigram, who runs an amazing tourism business in Broome. Yeah, we'll move on to the next one. Unfortunately, as well as having all those cultural and natural riches, we also have the 8th largest onshore gas basin in the world. You can see there, comparing it to other parts around the globe, just to give you a bit of perspective on where we are globally. We'll move on to the next one. And what we've done is we've got climate analytics, Bill Hare, who obviously is a climate change scientist of global renown. He's taken a look at what the implications are. And, you know, when you look at the potential for emissions, we're looking at more than double Australia's Paris Agreement commitments. And if you just do that click there. And so, you know, facing massive amounts of emissions if fracking takes off in the Kimberley. I'll go to the next slide. And you know, what are the implications of that? Well, obviously, adding serious emissions causing climate change. We're already in pretty serious trouble up here in Northern Australia. We are experiencing hotter weather, and we'd be facing a region that would effectively be unlivable if we keep burning oil and gas as we are. Fitzroy Crossing at the moment's got 2 months over 40 degrees every year on average. By 2090, it would have 225 days over 40 degrees. That's 7.5 months, unlivable, which is a major human rights issue for people who've been living there for over 50,000 years. They would be refugees in their own country. So just to give a bit of a background on who is you know, working here, who's trying to open up the Kimberley to fracking. You've got Burrup Energy there, who've been here for a number of years. You've got Thea Energy, another company that's been pushing. Thea Energy claim that they have 6 billion barrels of oil that could be fracked and come out of the Kimberley. They've got that little map there you see on the top right-hand side that they took to China when they accompanied the treasurer a few years ago, Ben Wyatt, on a trade trip, trying to sell some of their blocks there. What Thea Energy have said is that the area around where they are is comparable to the Eagle Ford gas basin in America. And the Eagle Ford had 0 wells in 2008. Now it's got 27,000 oil and gas wells in the Eagle Ford basin. That's the kind of comparisons that these companies are making. Then we've got Black Mountain here, their subsidiary Bennett Resources. I'll talk a little bit more about them. They're owned by a Texan billionaire. They've taken over leases from Mitsubishi, who exited a few years ago after we ran a bit of a campaign. But as you can see, that's their own map there with a pipeline that they would like to get to the Pilbara, essentially. So move to the next slide. And Black Mountain, you know, this is what they're targeting here. That's their lease. You can see in that light blue there, that's the Marawara Fitzroy River, National Heritage listed, and essentially National Heritage listed for its cultural values. That's the floodplain that goes with it. And you can see those 2 creeks that go through the middle of that lease. And what they want to do is, we'll just start going through the points there, is basically they want 20 wells to test with fracking. It would be the biggest fracking proposal ever in WA. And, you know, it would be 2 billion litres of water required for those 20 wells. They would be looking at tons of toxic chemicals, massive volumes of toxic wastewater produced. 2 wells have been fracked there, and they've turned out to be radioactive in terms of their wastewater. So, you know, our concern is big wet season and water going everywhere that's radioactive. So like I said, their plan is to put a pipeline to the Pilbara. To do that, they would need, you know, over 1,000 wells easily. And what we'd be facing would be a US Texan style scenario of a landscape of gas fields. Move on. Just to bring some, you know, stark reality to what we're facing at the last Woodside AGM. We had a question put in by Jess Beckling from the Cons Council, and basically asking, you know, has Woodside been in any discussions regarding onshore gas in the Kimberley? So what Meg O'Neill said, you can read it yourself there, that they would welcome the opportunity to have a discussion and help them to basically open up the Kimberley to fracking and get a pipeline down to the Pilbara. So that's the really serious situation we're in at the moment. And that's why extending the Northwest Shelf is such a big risk to the Kimberley. And all that gas would be exported, or all of it, 85% of it. And the state government has essentially put the 15% reservation in. So we'll move on there, Liam. Just to provide a little bit of a picture, we've been fighting against fracking now for over 12 years. We've pushed back against a number of different companies, along with our partners, Lock the Gate, Cons Council, Wilderness Society, ACF, and others. We've got Seed now coming on board. So we did actually push Alcoa out, Origin, Mitsubishi, and also Twiggy Forest, who exited after some pressure we put on. So we can do it. We just need to keep going, and we need to build the campaign. So go to the next slide. And again, you know, this is just an example where thousands of people got together in Fremantle. 25,000 people marched through the streets of Fremantle in 2013, and that was in January. And by April, Woodside had gone. You know, that's the kind of pressure that people can apply if we all get together and make a move against these oil and gas companies. Go to the next one. And this is just the final slide, really. You just keep going with this. You know, just things that you can do. People can have a copy of this slide. Obvious things like, you know, get your friends on our mailing list to get involved. Sending submissions in. We're expecting Black Mountain to do an EPBC referral soon. Getting the message out there with, you know, plastering your property with yellow triangles, your bumper stickers, get a T-shirt, posters, help us with events. Most importantly is talking to your local MP, and also, you know, if you're up for it, writing a personal letter to the Premier telling him how special the Kimberley is, and they should never, ever be opened up for fracking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, and for the presentation, but also all that you have done for that beautiful region up there, and all that you continue to do. 27,000 fracking wells in that beautiful, pristine environment, or anywhere really, is truly frightening. So please keep up the good work, and thanks for spreading the word. Most appreciated, mate. Okay, onwards and upwards. Next, we are going to hear from Ruby Hamilton from the Environmental Defenders Office. So a lot of, you know, the major parts of the Burrup Hub are currently under assessment, and Ruby is going to talk to us about this and a little bit more. You with us there, Ruby?
Yes. Hey, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you. All yours, my friend.
All right. Thanks, Liam. And thanks everyone else. Thanks for coming. My name is Ruby Hamilton. I'm a solicitor at the Environmental Defenders Office, or EDO. And I'll just be talking about the assessment and approval processes that are currently underway for the Northwest Shelf extension, focusing on that part of the Burrup Hub, but maybe touching on a few of the other assessment and approval processes. So I also want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Wajak Noongar Budja and Walyalap Fremantle, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Starting things off strong in probably the most boring part of this seminar with a disclaimer, just that this presentation is information only and is not legal advice. Moving on to another quick slide. Just an overview of the EDO. I'm sure lots of people here know about the EDO and what we do, and hopefully we've helped you in the past, but you can go and check out our website if you want more information. But getting stuck into the legal side of things. So just as a general basics point, in Australia, there's two main levels of government and legislation that we talk about today, the federal legislation as well as state legislation in WA. So we have the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act at the federal level, and we have the Environmental Protection Act at the WA level. And approvals are required under both these pieces of legislation. The federal legislation requires approval for actions which may have a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance. So that's matters like threatened species or internationally listed wetlands, the things that the Commonwealth government concerns itself with. And then in WA, you're also required to have an approval for a proposal that may have a significant impact on the WA environment. So a little bit more general there, it's to do with the WA environment at large, as our level of government is concerned with. So the Burrup Hub that we've been talking about today requires both federal and state approvals. That's that map that I think Anna included as well in her slides right at the top. And obviously you can see there are a lot of different components, and you might imagine there are a lot of different legal processes, and that's absolutely true. There are a few different pieces of legislation and different processes going on at the moment to do with the Burrup Hub. But to focus today, we'll just kind of go over the Northwest Shelf extension processes. So that's this gas plant that you can see in the corner that previous presentations have kind of given an overview of, the facility that was originally approved in the 1980s, but also just noting that the ongoing operation of that facility is linked to the development of Browse, as well as the existing Northwest Shelf gas fields and potentially future onshore or offshore developments. But just a little note as well that those approvals are being progressed, but the real world is moving as well. And as we can just see here, Woodside has been planning for many years and seems to be continuing to plan to shut down particular trains at this facility, trains being the part of the infrastructure that processes gas for export. So we can see that it's quite an old facility, and even though these approvals are being progressed, there's still real world movement towards or away from processing gas here. But back to the legal processes, I'll just kind of take you through the processes that apply for both levels of assessment. As Anna alluded to, there are also processes that apply for the different components like Browse, but I'll just focus here on the Northwest Shelf extension. And both of those processes start with a referral of the project under each piece of legislation. And that referral is to decide whether the project needs to go through the detailed assessment and approval process, and how that assessment is going to look. So these referrals of the Northwest Shelf extension were made back in 2018, along with various other components. You can see there, there's a referral under the EP Act and a referral under the EPBC Act, the second little screenshot. I'll just note with the EPBC Act, you remember I mentioned those matters of national environmental significance that piece of legislation deals with. And the matter of national environmental significance, the only matter that was identified to be assessed under the EPBC Act for this project was national heritage places. So as Piers was mentioning, the Dampier Archipelago is a listed national heritage place, and that is what the EPBC Act assessment is primarily concerned with. So I've just, for ease of reference, put the EPBC Act in blue just there on the slide, because I know it gets a little bit dicey as this process continues. So the next step after those referrals is a decision on how that assessment will be undertaken. So under the EP Act, we have our Environmental Protection Authority, the independent agency that undertakes environmental impact assessment in WA, and they assess the project and produce a report with their recommendations on whether the project should be implemented and on what conditions. But interestingly, for this referral under the EPBC Act, the federal government also decided to just use that EPA assessment to assess this project. So relying on that same process. And you can see that in 2022, as lots of people on this call will remember, the WA EPA published its assessment report following public consultation and documents from Woodside. It considered a number of environmental impacts, but ultimately recommended that each aspect of this project could be managed consistently with protecting the WA environment. But that's just one part of this. The next step within that process is that there's a right to appeal against an EPA report, but anyone who disagrees with the content and recommendations of the report. So as I think plenty of people on this call might remember, lodging an appeal against that EPA report, those appeals are made to the Minister for Environment in WA, and the appeals basically just deal with the contents of the EPA's assessment. So whether the EPA undertook an adequate assessment of environmental impacts of the project, whether any part of the report and the recommended conditions should be changed. So the appeal will be decided by the WA Minister relating to that EPA report. You might remember this was back in 2022, but there was a record number of appeals. There were 776 appeals lodged against that EPA report. And the current status of that is that those appeals are yet to be determined. So there are some people on this call that I'm sure are waiting for their appeal to be determined as well. And that's just a little extract from the Appeals Convener's website. So getting back into the approval process, and the final stage that I'll briefly discuss is the approval stage, which happens right after appeals against the EPA report are finalised. So once the decisions are made on the appeals against the EPA report, the next step is an approval decision made by the WA Minister in conjunction with other relevant decision-making authorities in the WA government. But interestingly, what also follows that appeal decision is that the federal assessment comes back into play, and we get back down to that blue EPBC Act level of the assessment. So Minister Plibersek must also make a decision on whether to approve the action under the EPBC Act. So there are some timing matters that make things a little different between the EP Act and the EPBC Act, but essentially the next stage after these appeals are determined is to proceed to that approval decision. So you might be wondering what happens in that approval decision. That's the next slide. I'll just go over a few of the considerations that are sort of spelt out in the legislation, because there are requirements for each minister to consider particular matters. The EP Act requires consideration of the EPA report as it stands following the appeals, if there are any changes made to the report. And other than that, the minister is not limited to environmental considerations. They can consider commercial considerations, social, political. It's essentially the stage of the process where different factors are balanced and coming to a decision on whether that approval should ultimately be given. So there is sort of quite a broad discretion and not a huge amount of detail in the WA legislation about what must be considered in that approval decision. If you look at the EPBC Act, there is a little bit more detail in terms of the things that have to be considered. Again, the EPA's report, because that is the method of assessment that's been determined for this project. There's also a couple of other matters in the legislation, like the principles of ecologically sustainable development, which includes things like the precautionary principle and the principle of intergenerational equity. But just a note on that is that they're just considerations. The minister is not bound to apply those principles in any particular way. There are a couple of other points in the legislation, those last two dot points, but I will just quickly note that another matter that Minister Plibersek will have to consider is further information that she obtains through requests. So the minister also has a power to seek any information that she requires in order to make an approval decision. And then the information that's provided must be considered. So in addition to having the EPA report and any internal federal government material, there can also be further information requested. But I think you can tell that the discretion is still ultimately quite broad. And again, all of these are just considerations rather than real limits on what the decisions look like. And one thing that might jump out from there as well is that neither of those lists include climate considerations. So despite this being Australia's biggest climate decision, there in WA or federal legislation, there are no real spelled out climate considerations. Obviously, this sort of thing is playing out not only in courtrooms with various cases reviewing decisions under these pieces of legislation for whether they were required to consider climate change and climate impacts, but also playing out in parliaments, as we all see with the EPBC Act reforms and the question of whether there should be a climate trigger inserted in that legislation expressly, as well as the climate legislation that is before the WA Parliament that seems to have reached something of a stalemate. So it's still a live question on whether climate will end up being a consideration in these types of approval decisions, but that is just a bit of an overview on the kinds of things that we can expect to see coming up in the North West Shelf extension approval decision. So I know that was a bit of a dump of information, but there's plenty of resources out there, including on the EDO website. For some reason, the next slide appears very ghostly and sparse. So there should be some more information on there. But if you do need anything, those are, I guess, are the main links. And so I hope it's been somewhat useful to understand how the legal process is operating with this project and what you can expect to see coming up soon. Thanks, Liam.
Thanks so much, Ruby. Sorry about that last slide. I'm not sure what happened there, but always great to understand the background processes and how the legal implications and assessment processes work and happen. So I really appreciate you going through that step by step for us. It's all happening at the moment on the Burrup Hub front. I'm going to move on to some climate impacts from the Burrup Hub. We were hoping to get Bill Hare to join us, but he's caught up in conferences overseas. So I'm just going to quickly run you through a few slides and then we'll get to some calls for actions. So as you can see on this screen, the climate crisis is well and truly with us, and every increment of global temperature increase will intensify multiple and concurrent hazards, including an increase in heat-related human mortality, greater prevalence of foodborne, waterborne, and vector-borne diseases, greater biodiversity loss in all types of ecosystems, a decrease in food production, and an increase in severe weather events, as we have all seen. So there's a clear imperative to confront the climate emergency in a decisive manner. And to do so, we all know this, the world must quickly and drastically reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. And again, we all know that Australia has suffered and seen some pretty drastic climate impacts. And already there's a lengthy list of climate change related impacts, including marine and land heat waves, bigger, hotter bushfires, shifts in rainfall regimes, drought, flooding, more intense cyclones, and of course, deadly heat waves that strike us every summer. So climate change is making these events more likely, more severe, more frequent, and extending their time frame of occurrence. These natural disasters are fast becoming unnatural. So this is just an infographic here that was released on the back of the IPCC's last report. This was an update from last year as to where things are now. And it's a show of the latest key indicators of global climate change. Just going to admit someone there. And they show that greenhouse gas concentrations are all up. Total greenhouse gas emissions are not decreasing. Human-induced warming has increased, and our remaining carbon budget for a 50% chance at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is now just at 200 gigatons. And that was at the start of this year. So that budget has been drastically reduced since then. But at this figure, 200 gigatons, the Burrup Hub is poised to occupy 3% of the total 1.5 degree carbon budget. That's just one project in one state, in one nation, occupying a total of 3% of a global budget for a pretty critical target. As most of you know, the IPCC states that projected CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure is more than enough to exceed the remaining carbon budget for a 50% chance at 1.5 degrees. And also on top of that, the IEA states, that's the International Energy Agency, states that there can be no new fossil fuel projects if the global energy sector is to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and help avoid catastrophic climate change. So no new fossil fuel projects is the norm we need in order to meet international climate goals. And not only is the Burrup Hub a new and extended fossil fuel project, it requires other new fossil fuel projects just to keep it running. Recent research shows that the present expansion of LNG capacity globally vastly exceeds levels consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and is more consistent with a global warming outcome of 3 degrees, which is straight up disastrous. The global liquefied natural gas expansion exceeds the demand for coal to gas switching. That's the name of the report that was put out on this just recently. And just to touch on some of the implications of why every single small part of global warming matters. This is a little infographic from the Climate Council that shows just the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming. And you can see from that, the loss of plant species is 2 times worse, loss of insect species 3 times worse. We pretty much obliterate all coral reefs on Earth, and extreme heat impacts and occurrences will be 2.6 times worse, just with that extra 0.5 degree warming, which these new fossil fuel projects are pushing us both towards and beyond. And also on top of that, we have these climate tipping points. We're moving past certain temperature thresholds, also puts us at dire risk of engaging these climate tipping points. So once the tipping point of a system is passed, change becomes self-perpetuating until a new state is reached, regardless of whether global temperatures continue to rise or not. So at current levels of heating, we have 5 climate tipping points that may have already been breached. A further 5 tipping points could be breached within the 1.5 to 2 degree range, heating range, with another 3 becoming possible within the range of heating expected under current global policies. So I'm not going to run through all of these, but there's a few there that you may be familiar with, and also might just be a little bit scary to kind of contemplate what these might mean for us and the rest of the world. And these are the ones at higher temperature thresholds here. So all of that information was quite a lot, and we wouldn't have brought you along tonight just for a little sob story if there wasn't something that we could actually do about it. So to begin that, I just want to show a few examples of how our communities, both here in Burrup, on Wajak Nyunga Buja, and across Australia, have been fighting back and standing up to their right for a safe and livable climate, and also speaking up for those that can't speak for themselves. So at the start of this year, we launched the Save Scott Reef campaign down at the Fremantle Town Hall, over 300 participants. You'll see some of our speakers from tonight down in the front row, and plenty of local community there. John Butler down in the front row there as well. That was a beautiful evening and got quite a lot of press as well, and really kicked off that campaign. We've been at, yearly we protest at various events. One of the big ones is the Woodside AGM. Again, a great turnout this year. And the media are really starting to pick up on this as well. And there were some movements at this year's Woodside AGM where investors who own shares in Woodside actually set a world record for the number of investors that voted against a company's climate plan. That was set at 58%. And here's just a collation of photos of various little activities and campaign moments from throughout WA. In particular, we have meetings outside of MP offices. We have get-togethers up in Exmouth and Broome, launching, Scott Reef campaign stuff as well there. Public rallies with some brilliant speakers. We've been door knocking, we've been out in the streets holding stalls and talking to people, and generally just spreading the good word. So what can you do if you are not involved already, which many of you would be? But first and foremost, unfortunately, it's still the case where we have people speaking for us, and as a community, we really need to show both the state and federal MPs that climate change and environmental impacts are, first and foremost at the front of our minds when we come to think about, how we're going to vote. And part of this, we really need to get in contact with MPs, share that information, and share our thoughts and feelings. We've set up a do-gooder page here to make that very easy for you. You can just fill in your details as you run through that link there, and this is all going to be shared afterwards, so you can get onto that quite easily. Another thing you can do is just, like, if you're more confident, you can write or call your local MP, as Martin mentioned. And also, it's pretty important that Roger Cook is feeling this heat as well in regards to upcoming elections and how much climate change matters to the people of both Western Australia, but also Australia on the federal front. As Ruby mentioned, if you are an appellant on the Northwest Shelf Project extension, you have yet another opportunity to engage in that process. You would have received an email over the last week from the Appeals Committee via the Environment Minister of WA, Rhys Whitby. And please get in touch with us here at CCWA. We've sent out some information this afternoon in an email, but if you did not receive that and you would like to contact the committee, please get in touch with us if you need a hand on that. And also, as Ruby mentioned, and Anna as well, decisions are imminent on the Burrup Hub, and particularly with the Northwest Shelf Project extension. So we really need to show up in big numbers, you know, like Martin showed there on the streets of Fremantle, getting 25,000 people out in the streets, you know, fighting for their right to a clean environment and a safe climate. We need to respond to these decisions, if they do come out on the negative front, in a really strong way that shows how much we care about climate change. Another thing you can do is join a local climate group, wherever you might be. If you are in WA, we have plenty of Go Beyond Gas groups that you can join up to, and also to stay in touch and up to date with the latest events that are happening around your state, wherever you might be in Australia. And part of that, again, Go Beyond Gas, we are actually hosting some events this weekend, doing some door knocking out in local communities. So if you are keen to get involved in that, please visit the website here or just simply get in touch with us. This is just a quick run through of what you'll see when you sign up to the do-gooder there. Simple entry page, and then you can either write your own message, which is more effective, but we have a message there all set up for you. This is the letter that you would have received if you're an appellant from the Appeals Committee. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'm sorry we've run 6 minutes over. I should have seen that coming, so much content to get through. Please, if you have to run, feel free to leave at this moment, but if any of our speakers are willing to stay on for 5 to 10 minutes and take some questions, if we do have any, that would be most appreciated. And just got a message in the chat here from Rachel saying if anyone up in the Pilbara wants to connect with the Pilbara Climate Network, she's just put some details there to reach out to her at rachel.enviro@gmail.com. Okay, so we just have a question here from Michael Norman. Thanks, Michael, for the question. So the government is saying the safeguard mechanism and offsets solve the climate issue. Please comment. I can start on that. Oh, Anna, did you want to go there?
Yeah, I can do. So the safeguard mechanism is marred by a lot of issues when you look into it, and it just covers Scope 1 emissions is one of them. And I would say again with offsets, if you look at the work coming from ANU, and I think is it Andrew McIntosh, offsets, carbon offsets are a real big problem, and a lot of it can just be, you know, sort of numbers on a spreadsheet, but when it comes down to reality, it doesn't make a big impact and the projects aren't working. But I don't know if another presenter wants to expand any more.
Yeah, I would just add on that front, Anna, on top of the, that it doesn't even consider the scope 3 emissions, just how big they are, and they make up, 85 to 90% of Australia's total emissions are exported, and the safeguard mechanism does not touch or even think about or consider those emissions. And also, yeah, everything is just entirely offsettable. So there's no kind of like tangible, we're not actually stopping emissions going into the atmosphere through the safeguard mechanism. Piers, I saw you come off mute there. Did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'll just say this is something that the gas industry has been lobbying for a very long time, to get rid of state-based conditions on their gas projects. And the reason for that is the Commonwealth regime, the current one being the safeguard mechanism, is far more lenient on these projects. And I've done some modelling of the safeguard mechanism, and it's unlikely that it's really going to result in any real reductions of emissions here in Western Australia, because of the way that it allows offsetting of emissions as a primary priority rather than actually reducing them, first and foremost. That's been mentioned. But secondly, because the safeguard mechanism has a whole lot of concessions for certain industry types which are exposed to international trade. Of course, Western Australia's major emitters are exposed to international trade, the LNG industry and of course the mining industry. And the other problem for us here in WA is that we're starting from such a high starting point. Our emissions here are about 60% higher than 2005 levels. And to get them back to 43% below 2005 levels requires a much bigger abatement effort than the safeguard mechanism will deliver. So the safeguard mechanism can't be relied upon to even address the direct scope, what's called the scope 1 emissions from these projects, and does nothing at all to address the far bigger scope 3 emissions, which is in the billions of tonnes when these fossil fuel products are exported. Essentially, the safeguard mechanism is an enabler for gas expansion and fossil fuel expansion, and that's not something that we should be relying on in Western Australia or anywhere else to address the problems with these projects.
Great, thank you, Piers. And Ruby has just put an additional note in the chat there as well from a legal perspective. I do have to mention our social media manager is watching online and has told me to give a plug to our social media, various social media platforms as well. So if anyone's out there who's big on the socials, just give @GoBeyondGas a follow. We have another comment there recommending a documentary, also from Mary, saying we need to encourage households to get out of gas. Strong agree. And also LGAs should require no gas in new houses or buildings. Can CCWA promote this? Yeah, it's certainly a great initiative, Mary, and thanks for bringing it up. Our Better Climate team are working strongly on the solutions side to the climate crisis that we are facing, and part of that is certainly looking to move beyond gas and electrify not just suburbs but the wider state and beyond. And part of that, I'll just add to the LGAs, there's a really good point and a really good kind of campaign moment and tactic there that these councils and local government areas can be encouraged to take that alongside just declaring a simple action of declaring a climate emergency, and also there should be and is in some cases like a strong push to ban fossil fuel advertising in local government areas as well. Just going through the chat here. Okay, seems like just a bit of discussion, but a great point from Anna, just to end fossil fuel companies' social license. And yeah, it is a big thing, the public narrative that the fossil fuel companies push and rely on, to convince the public that gas in particular is something that we need, when in fact it's a dirty, rotten, filthy, polluting fossil fuel. So yeah, we have to continue to try and counter this push from fossil fuel companies and, just expose the truth as to how bad it is for us and society. All right, still a little bit going on in the chat there, but I'm going to have to, some of our speakers have to leave us, so I'm going to call an end to this webinar. Huge thanks to everyone that joined us tonight. Your ongoing love and support is very much appreciated. We certainly need all of you, in this campaign for the climate. And also thank you again to all of our speakers tonight. Anna Chapman from CCWA, Ruby Hamilton from the Environmental Defenders Office, Piers Verstegen from Climate Safe Solutions, and Martin Pritchard from Environs Kimberley. Please do get in touch if you have any questions about this webinar. We'll send out a recording and a follow-up email tomorrow. But until then, just take care of yourself and take care of each other. And thanks so much.
Thanks, Liam.
Thank you very much.